What is childhood trauma and do you have it? Childhood trauma is an experience that was frightening or felt dangerous and really made you feel unsafe or like your well-being was in jeopardy. And this can happen from an actual experience that you had or from witnessing something happening to someone else. So maybe you weren't the recipient of a parent's abuse, but you saw your other parent being the victim of the abuse. That still counts as childhood trauma because just witnessing it made you feel unsafe and like you weren't being cared for in the way that you needed in that moment. And childhood trauma can happen at any age, from infancy all the way up. And so we all have things happen when we're kids that feel safe, unsafe, or scary or dangerous. But childhood trauma is when it creates a response within you long after the actual experience has happened. And this can be a physical response, such as a racing heart, feeling sick to your stomach, actually throwing up, or the pain from an injury that resulted from the experience. It can also be emotional too and create this feeling of helplessness or fear or anxiety. So that's really the big key factor, is that it's something that affects you long after the event has happened. And it can be an acute instance. That means it's just a single thing. For instance, when I was in third grade, my house was broken into. We were coming home from seeing Ninja Turtles 2 with Vanilla Ice. So that gives you a little bit of a clue about how old I am. And we lived in a townhouse, and I had this irrational fear that someone was always in our house because the walls were so paper thin that you could hear the neighbors talking on the phone, you could hear the neighbors showering, you could hear the neighbors having just a conversation at the dinner table with their family. So it always sounded like someone was in our house. And on this night, we walked in the front door, my dad and I heard this loud thud and said, "Someone's in the house." And my dad, of course, disregarded the comment. "No, Kim, no one's in the house. It's just the neighbors." And then we hear a second loud thud. So at that point, my dad leaves me standing in the doorway. I'm in third grade, so I'm 9. And he runs up the stairs screaming, "Who's in my house?" And as he gets to his bedroom door, he sees the man jump from his second-story bedroom window. So that was incredibly traumatizing. I ended up in therapy. I had a hard time falling asleep alone in my room because it really perpetuated that fear that someone was in our house. So that was an acute instance. Knock on wood, my house, any house I've lived in has never been burglarized since. So there's also chronic instances of trauma, and that's where it's repeated and prolonged. So an instance of chronic trauma was when my mom was deployed for Desert Storm, again, when I was in third grade. Third grade was a rough year, guys. And so that was prolonged because I had this constant worry, this constant fear that with her being over in the war, that she was going to die and she wasn't going to come home. And it was just very traumatic. And so navigating that during the school day and at home, it was really hard. And then here's something else. In third grade, my dad married my stepmom, and I really wasn't happy about that because I didn't really care for my stepmom. So there was a lot of chronic and prolonged exposure to situations where I felt like I was unsafe, I was scared, my well-being was in question. So that was chronic and prolonged. But honestly, I really am a person who has suffered from complex childhood trauma because I had exposure to varied multiple events from my childhood. So it started with my parents' divorce when I was a toddler, then the house being broken into, my mom being deployed, my dad getting remarried. There was my mom's marriage to my stepdad was very tumultuous growing up. So there was a lot of arguing, fighting, things like that. And then in high school, I started dating a guy, and that was led to becoming a very abusive relationship, physically, mentally, emotionally, and sexually. So there was exposure to varied and multiple events over my childhood period of time. So that's actually complex. So there's the breakdown. But here's the thing, is that there really are two main sources of trauma: externally, which means outside of your immediate family or home, and that's environmental. So it could be a natural disaster. For instance, we just had bad storms roll through last week, and there were people in my community who didn't have power for 5 days. So they were displaced from their homes. There can be community trauma. So there's also a community that not far from where I live, and the gun violence is so astronomically high. The rate of gun violence is that the CDC is actually studying why that is the case. And it's partly due to the poverty in the area. And so those are some external ways that you can experience childhood trauma. But then there's also the internal, and that means within our family. So that's domestic violence, it's abuse, it can be physical, emotional, mental, sexual. It can also be neglect, and that can be physical neglect or emotional neglect. And then there's also the separation from caretakers. So that's through divorce, that's through the military with deployments, or it could be because of an incarceration. And then there's also just general dysfunction that can impact the household. And so that can be due to substance abuse, that can be due to untreated mental illness, or even treated mental illness. And so, because mental illnesses can be challenging to navigate at times. But when we have these experiences that are traumatic, it creates a response, a reaction within us that happens long after the event has happened. And so it can be an emotional upset where you just are very emotional, and that happens at the snap of your fingers. You can have this sense of anxiety that just lingers all the time. You can not have the ability to regulate yourself. So when you get upset, you're upset for a very long period of time and you just can't seem to shake it. There's also unhealthy attachments within relationships that you have. So there's enmeshment, there's codependency, and then there's also regression in behavior. So that means, going back to um, behaviors of younger time. That's mostly when you're a child where you regress. So like some children will regress to wetting the bed, they'll regress to sucking their thumb. And then there's also having trouble with sleeping, not being able to fall asleep at night or stay asleep. And so these symptoms, they reappear for us as adults when we experience something that's similar to that childhood trauma that we've experienced. So this is really childhood trauma in a nutshell: what it is, how it happens, where it happens, how it can affect you. And so if you are someone who is working through childhood trauma, and you're maybe in the beginning of the journey or the middle of the journey, you just feel like you're not making the progress that you want, don't fret. So you are in the right place. And I'm so glad that you found my channel, because this channel is going to be such a valuable resource for you and give you the information that you're looking for. So you can say goodbye to the Google rabbit hole, the thought spirals, the endless reading, all of those things. So I'm so happy that you're here. So be sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date and in tune with all the videos that are coming your way. And most importantly, though, please make sure to take time for yourself. That is the most important thing, because going on a healing journey is a challenge. It is a marathon, not a sprint. So I will see you on the next video. Thanks so much for tuning in.